This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, G. Sampath. The Great Nicobar Island is the southernmost island in the Andaman and Nicobar archipelago in the Bay of Bengal. It is home to various rare species of flora and fauna which are not found anywhere else on the earth. It is designated as a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. It is also the habitat of indigenous communities, including the Nicobarese, which is a scheduled tribe, and the Shompen people, classified as a particularly vulnerable tribal group. The island is also located on a seismically high volatile zone and experiences, on an average, one earthquake a week of varying magnitudes. But now, in the face of all these facts, the government of India plans to unleash a 72,000 crore mega infrastructure project on this very island. The project plan, piloted by the Niti Aayog, includes a 40,000 crore international container transshipment terminal, an international airport, a gas and solar based power plant, and a township stretching over 16,610 hectares. This project will, as it comes into existence, it will decimate about 131 square kilometers of pristine tropical evergreen forest. It will destroy the only primary nesting place of the giant leatherback turtle. It will violate the forest rights of the indigenous population, and it will settle 350,000 people on an island whose current population is 8,500. And yet it has got every clearance from the Union Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. And with appeals to the National Green Tribunal or NGT also failing, this mega project seems all set to go ahead. So, how serious are the risks and dangers associated with this project? How credible are the environment impact assessments that have been done? Is the law of the land with respect to the local tribal communities being followed? And do the strategic and developmental gains from this project outweigh the environmental costs and risks involved? We take a close look at all these questions in this deep dive episode of InFocus, and we have with us Dr. Pankaj Seksharia, a researcher and academic writer who has written extensively on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands for over 3 decades and has recently curated the anthology The Great Nicobar Betrayal. Pankaj, welcome to InFocus. Thank you so much for making time for this podcast.
Thank you, Sampa. Thank you for having me here.
So, Pankaj, to start with, I was wondering if you can give us a quick overview for the benefit of our listeners of what we have right now in Great Nicobar Island. What is it on that island that is of value that we should value? What is it in its surroundings that is of great value to us, and which, because of this value, we should preserve as a matter of first principles and not open it up for cost benefit analysis, trade offs, and so on? What is so valuable in keeping the island the way it is?
Hi, Sampath. I think the point you make of first principles, I think, is very, very important. And the singularity of some of the issues and some of what we have in that particular island is something that needs to be taken note of. And you yourself mentioned some of those points in the introductory note. So we have Great Nicobar Island, which is roughly a 900 odd square kilometer island, very small by any mainland standards, but a very large island by the standards of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which is roughly 8,000 square kilometers. So this island itself is about 10% of the total area of this island group. Now, really, almost 90 to 95% or even more of this island is clothed in tropical evergreen, thick evergreen forest, which has hardly been disturbed, if I might put it that way, by the outside hand. Like you mentioned, it is the home of the Nicobarese and of the PVTG community, the particularly vulnerable tribal group, the Shompen, who've been living here for thousands of years. There are a few hundred of these community members who live deep in the forest, whom we know very little about. We know very little about both the Shompen and also the forest that they inhabit. So you have almost 900 square kilometers of lush tropical evergreen forest, which is a treasure house in ways that we don't fully know. It is a case, like we say, of the known unknown and the unknown unknown. There are perhaps species of plants and animals that are new to science, And invariably, when any detailed research happens in these islands, and certainly Great Nicobar, something new is found out all the time. So there are some numbers of what species exist, but that perhaps is an underestimate in the sense that maybe there is much more out there. There is a very high degree of endemism in these islands. Also in Great Nicobar, you have species of plants and animals that are
Can you
found.
explain what do you mean by endemism?
So endemism, I was just coming to that. What I was saying is that these islands are particularly important because of very high degrees of endemism, generally in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, but also specifically Great Nicobar. Endemism is a phenomenon which suggests that species of plants and animals are geographically restricted to only that landscape. So you have butterflies, birds, reptiles, plants that are found only in Great Nicobar Island and nowhere else on planet Earth. Now, this is a huge biodiversity asset. It's the inheritance of this planet, of us as a species on this planet, and about 160 square kilometers of the land of Great Nicobar that you spoke about that will go with the project. Even within this 20% or 25% of this island, there are species that are found, like I said, nowhere else. So this makes it very, very important and very, very precious and very vulnerable. There is also the coastline, particularly the beaches are very spectacular beaches, and we have some of the most important nesting sites of marine sea turtles in the entire northern Indian Ocean. For example, the largest of the sea turtles, known as the giant leatherback, nests on the beaches also of these islands, but prominently on Great Nicobar. And one of its most important nesting sites is going to be sacrificed for the port that you mentioned in the introduction. And there are other coastal species. There are mangrove species. There are all kinds of things that we don't know about. And that's one of the essays in the book that you mentioned on the cetaceans. There is such little documentation on what is there in the oceans around this particular island. Even the species that are known do not find a mention in the EIA report, in the project documents, in any point of consideration. So we are talking of an absolute treasure house. And what we will lose if this project comes up is something that is lost forever. It can never, never be replaced.
Right. Thank you for that sort of laying out the broad picture in terms of the loss of biodiversity. I think the key point here, Pankaj, is this unknown. And you mentioned the environment impact assessment report. I mean, we'll come back to that in a later question. But I'm just curious if where there are so many unknowns, like you don't know much about the species, the flora, fauna in the center of the island. So how do you know how they're going to be impacted, right? So I mean that's a question. I don't know how you can talk about the environment impact on those species when you don't know what those species are. Anyway, so coming to the human side of this entire issue, everybody knows about the Forest Rights Act, which aims to protect the rights of forest dwelling communities anywhere in India. So in this particular project, it is being said by the project document itself that at least 1 million trees will be cut to make to make the land for available for all these airports and container terminals and so on. So 1 million trees are going to go. So that is also part of the inheritance of the indigenous communities. And I mean, I've read reports saying that for cutting any tree on this island, you need to take the permission of these local communities. So, are the Shompen and the Nicobarese communities of Great Nicobar aware of this 1 million trees going to be cut? And if yes, are they fine with it? What are their thoughts? Have that been taken into account?
So, let me begin by this number of 1 million. This actually is on the much lower side of what the numbers are going to be. So, this number of 1 million actually is of roughly a number that comes from the project documents itself. And for a long time, we were going with the number, which itself is a very, very high number. Imagine in this moment and this situation of climate crisis that we're dealing with and making pledges and commitments of all kinds on the national and global stage. Here you have one single project that is formally, officially, even in parliament, a statement was made saying that up to 9.5 lakh trees will be cut. But just in the last couple of months, there have been some very interesting reports in the media and by researchers to say that this could be a minimum of 3 million trees, could even be 10 million trees. So 130 square kilometers of pristine tropical evergreen forest with the density of trees that it has, 1 million trees is a gross underestimate. So we are talking of a much, much larger scale, many orders of magnitude larger than what has been suggested. This also puts the environmental and the forest clearance under question, because if the project document said we will cut X number of trees, and this is the basis of the clearances that have been granted. What happens when those estimates are are under by a factor of 3 or even a factor of 10 for that matter? So that's a separate issue and a very significant and a big concern. But yes, absolutely linked to this issue is the rights of these indigenous communities. They've been here for thousands of years. They are dependent, very intricately dependent on the forest, the Shompen, for instance. Not much is known about their lifestyles, about the way they live in the forest. They live secluded lives that they don't really interact too much with the outside world. And what has happened in this particular case is that the agencies of the state that are mandated for the protection and the welfare of these communities have become the agency that have granted have spoken on their behalf, so to say. So in a very interesting twist that happened, the Great Nicobari community, which is a lot more in engagement with the outside world. The Shompen are very difficult to access. The language is not known. It's very difficult to understand what they want to say. Even then, a few years ago, there was a report by anthropologists that was actually commissioned by the Niti Aayog, researchers and anthropologists, in which there are some statements by the Shompen saying that, please leave us alone. It was not so much about the project in particular, but generally that they want to be left alone to lead the lives that they want to lead. Beyond that, it's very difficult to understand what the Shompen want because we are not really in conversation with them. Where the Great Nicobari are concerned, they did initially approve the project, and this is documented. But very soon, and all these details are there in the Great Nicobar betrayal that you mentioned, when they got to know of the full details of the project, they almost immediately issued a very detailed letter withdrawing the no objection certificate that they had given to the project. And among the key contentions of theirs is that they were displaced when the tsunami of 2004 happened. They lost a lot of lives of their community members. The people who survived were brought the to and around in and around the areas of the main headquarters, which is Campbell Bay, on the promise that they will be allowed to go back to their traditional lands. Now they've been living here for almost 2 decades, and there is no sign or sight of having a chance to go back. So they said that they are okay with the project, and then they realized that actually, at least there are some parts of where the project is going to come up, which were their traditional lands and which were lands that they want to go back to. And they said that we did not have the full information when you came to us for the permissions, and we withdraw our no objection certificate. Very explicit, and there are two very nice articles in the book by two anthropologists, researchers who talk about the conditions and the challenges of the indigenous communities. So they have been pretty much bypassed, and this is a very serious violation of the Forest Rights Act and a number of other local regulations. And I'll just add one point here is that among the many documents that we've put together, there is a note by the administration's tribal welfare department, which is mandated by the state to look after these communities, which actually says in a letter to the project proponent, says that we will facilitate the denotification of the tribal reserve and make available land for the project if you so need. So it's a classic case of the fence eating up the garden, as it were. So that agency and that structure that was supposed to look after the welfare is itself offering the land and the resources of this community for this project to come up. So at multiple levels, there's a problem with what's going to happen with these indigenous people. And also, if I may just add quickly, is that you also mentioned this. Imagine 1,000 tribal people on this island, and within 30 years, if the project comes through, there'll be 3.5 lakh people. So look at the ratio of the tribal to the outsider. And then whatever you might do, the demands of the outsider, the settlers, the people who come in for the land, for the resources, for the water, will completely overshadow the indigenous community. They'll be wiped out culturally, physically, in all kinds of ways.
Right. I mean, that's a pretty grim scenario. I mean, these local communities, indigenous populations have clearly withdrawn their no objection certificate, as you pointed out, and the agency vested with the responsibility of taking care of their welfare is actually speaking to the project authorities, saying that we will make sure that land is available. Now, I was just thinking aloud, in what way is this different from a colonial project? Because there is this place, this geography. The geography has its own indigenous population who have been living an autonomous existence. Then there is this external force which is coming and led by a certain whatever mechanisms of development, whatever you call it. How is this different from settler colonialism, where you're going to settle 350,000 people from somewhere else and overwhelm the native population? Is this not settler colonialism?
No, no, we can call it by any term. I mean, and but the fact of the matter, and you're right in that sense, is that what is going to happen to these people? What is going to happen to this landscape? What is going to happen to their survival base and to all those forests and those resources? What happens to their history? What happens to everything that we, as a people and a country, say we hold valuable and we should hold valuable? Because there are so many singularities to the way this whole landscape is laid out, the people, the relationships, the ocean. So there is no justification, in my opinion, of bringing in so many people. And there is also the issue, and I think you mentioned this again in the beginning, is of what will happen to these 3.5 lakh people, because we are sitting in a very, very vulnerable, very tectonically active zone, and we are knowingly bringing 300,000 people and pushing them into harm's way over here. And this is in addition, of course, to the damage that will be caused in so many ways to the indigenous communities and the local biodiversity and forests.
Right, of course. I mean, the reason I brought in this whole colonial aspect, Pankaj, is because it seems to be part of a pattern. I mean, we have seen this pattern playing out in different domains in the past, also, and historically speaking, where even if, for instance, we are able to, let's say, the Indians in the mainland, so to speak, are able to identify the people as Indians, as fellow Indians. I'm sure I think the imagination at play would be much different in terms of how we conceptualize their rights, their dignity, and so on. And I'm not sure if that is also so much at play in terms of their voices being heard. I don't mean Shompen don't want to be as in involved in this in any way, as you said. They just want to be left alone. But I don't think that wish to be left alone is going to be respected if this project goes ahead. And there's no way.
Absolutely. And like you say, I mean, this is not uncommon. We are seeing this so much on the mainland as well. I mean, large areas of forest India, large areas of Adivasi areas are being taken away for projects, and they have been since the time of independence. So, in that sense, yes, it's a continuation. But here we have an opportunity of rethinking this, and I think we should in that sense.
Right, absolutely. Now, given we have looked at the biodiversity aspect, we've looked at the indigenous populations' rights aspect. Now, coming to the third main issue here, which is the process followed for giving all kinds of environmental and other clearances. Now, how did that happen? How robust were these environment impact assessment processes and the forest clearances being given? Was due process followed? Was there like enough of consultations happening? Did the ecologists, environmentalists sit in with government officials and say, okay, this is how you protect this leatherback turtle, for instance. This is how you protect, this particular coral reef or whatever. Did that happen?
If one was to talk of the process, Sampath, we could be speaking for the entire length of this podcast. But let me give you, 2 or 3 examples of what really happened and how this has been made to happen. So on the one hand, one can argue that due process has been followed, because here we have, at least on paper, all the clearances that are required are being sought or have already been granted. So we're talking of primarily the environmental clearance and the forest clearance and environmental and the CRZ clearance. But I'll just point to you some facts to you and some interesting things of how this was done, just as a sample of the process that was really followed. So the project, in a sense, was initiated via a report that was published by AECOM India Private Limited, which is a Gurgaon-based consultancy company, which was contracted by the Niti Aayog, and they published an initial project report in March of 2021.
Pankaj, just to sorry to interrupt, but I seem to remember this ACOM report from 2016, which said categorically that we would not advise a transshipment terminal. It's not feasible. Let's just stick to a cruise facility. Isn't that what the ACOM report said? Yeah.
Absolutely, you are absolutely right, and this is really very intriguing. That what's happened in 5 years. In just 5 years, for them to now say that this is a viable, feasible, economically viable, and feasible project. So this is a question that needs to be asked, and I'm really glad you brought this up. I was going to mention that. But if we come to how this whole thing began in the latest space, is March 2021 was this holistic development of Great Nicobar Island, this project report that was released by AECOM India Limited. Now, in October of 2020, 6 months before this project report is even published, there is a request for the denotification of the 130 square kilometers of forest that were eventually de-reserved for this project. So even before one can argue that formally the project has been conceived and the proposal has been made, so how is it possible that somebody will know that this kind of land is required or this kind of forest area is required for this project? For example, that's point number one. Point number two is in again this report is published only in March 2021. In January of that year, Galathea Bay, which is a 12 square kilometer bay in the southernmost part of the island and where the transshipment port is supposed to come up. It's a very beautiful bay with a turtle nesting site. And it is a wildlife sanctuary. In 1990s, in the 1990s, it was declared as a wildlife sanctuary because of the ecological and the biological value of that space. Now, 2 months before the project, even the project proposal is published, leave alone the process for seeking the clearances, the National Board of Wildlife in the Ministry of Environment and Forests has gone ahead, held a meeting, put up a proposal for the denotification of the sanctuary, and it has been denotified 2 months before the project becomes a reality. The project proposal becomes a reality. And there is unfortunately the director of the Wildlife Institute of India is there in the meeting, and he says it is okay. We should ensure in some way that the nesting continues in this place. And 3 months later, in June, or 4 months later in June, when somebody filed an RTI with the WII, with the Wildlife Institute of India, their reply said that we have not done any research work on any turtles in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. But they had the authority and they were allowed the authority to sign away Galathea Bay, which is perhaps the most important nesting site of the giant leatherback in the entire northern Indian Ocean. That's point number one. And the interesting thing is that this bay has a mouth opening of about 3 kilometers today. And you can imagine a sea turtle and many other creatures swimming into the bay with that opening of a mouth. The mouth opening will now be restricted to just 300 meters because you're going to build breakwaters for the port and the berths. So you're expecting a sea turtle who has been using a 3 kilometer opening to now restrict herself to just 300 meters. And imagine a situation when the port is operational, there are ships coming in and out, sound, light, pollution, oil pollution, etc. And the leading scientific institution of the country says that the turtles will continue to nest. And one more point I'll just make is that where the forest clearance is concerned, I mentioned in October 2020, approval is sought for the forest to be cleared, 130 square kilometers. The approval came 2 years later in October of 2022. So one interesting thing is that one is already asking for de-reservation without even actually having a project proposal in hand. Now, what's very interesting is that we tracked this very carefully. Between October 2020, when clearance was sought for the forest diversion, when forest diversion was sought, and October 2022, when the forest diversion was finally granted, the Forest Advisory Committee in the MoEFCC had 26 meetings to discuss various projects. From the records that we have in the public domain, and they should be in the public domain, this project was not discussed in even one of the meetings of the FAC. But 2 years later, there's a letter which says permission has been granted. We have written to members of the FAC and nobody has responded to say what happened and how they went ahead and granted clearance. So, again and again and again, we see that this is the kind of process. If you look at the EI report, it is laughable. There are bits that we have written, I've written about. The environmental conditions that have been put for the project to be cleared, they are a joke. They are a kind of a condition that cannot simply be implemented.
Like, for example,
there is one which says that
I remember something about this owl's nest being,
I was just
counting
mentioning
them
that.
and all.
Yeah. So they say that the nesting holes of endemic owls should be identified in this forest and the trees should be geotagged and then they should be protected if possible. Now, if anybody listening is a bird watcher, you know how difficult it is to find an owl. And we are talking here of 130 square kilometers of pristine tropical evergreen forest where trees can grow up to a height of about 100 and 250 feet. Imagine locating a owl. Imagine now trying to locate the nesting hole of an endemic owl. Actually, I did a back of the envelope calculation some time back, and something to the effect that even if we had 10 of our best bird watchers spending 6 months a year because other 6 months it's raining, to just go and look at each of these trees, even 1 million trees, not even 3 million trees, because you need to see every tree for a nest owl. How will you know otherwise whether the owl is nesting or not? And even if 5 minutes were given for each tree, which is a gross underestimate, we will require something like 80,000 hours to map out a forest of 1 million trees. That's more than 20 years required. And this is when clearance has been granted and work will start. So, this is, I would argue, deliberately a condition that cannot be implemented. So, what's the point of a condition and an environmental condition of this kind? And I will also just make one point which came to my notice very recently is that they have actually called for proposals for contractors and others to actually enumerate and cut the trees. So they don't know how they're going to do that. So they've invited expressions of interest, and all kinds of agencies have actually, including railway companies on mainland India and consultants and all that. Cutting a tree in a tropical rainforest is not an easy task at all. And cutting 1 million trees is going to be a mammoth task. Probably 1 million trees have not been cut in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in the entire 100-year history of logging that began in the late 19th century. But what the document says is that the hardwoods will be used for something and the softwoods will be cut and fed into the power plants for electricity generation. Now, this is the thinking that they have, and I was absolutely amazed. This is a document I saw just a month ago, and a very recent document. So this, this amounts to almost like, you enter a library of rare manuscripts. You pick out a rare manuscript, and you're feeling cold or you want to have a barbecue, so you pull out these pages from the rare manuscript and you feed it into the fire. And this is what we are doing actually. This is such a unique forest. This is such a singular forest, such a rare forest. And the casualness with which we are saying we'll cut it down and burn it for something just shows the complete lack of understanding, a complete apathy, a complete lack of any value for this absolute precious richness and wealth that we have. So there are many examples of this kind.
Yeah,
Yeah,
one
sorry.
other thing I wanted to ask you. So, I think the condition for giving a clearance to sort of get rid of all these trees and this forest for this many square kilometers is that they will do compensatory afforestation in Haryana. Now, where is this law, this rule coming from? Is it internationally recognized as okay to do that, or do we have a domestic rule? If you cut whatever 1 million trees in Andaman, you can compensate for it by planting 2 million trees in Haryana. Like, where is this coming from?
This is one of the most ridiculous things that has happened, and everybody now agrees, even in the field of environment and environmental economics and restoration, that this idea of compensatory afforestation, which is always problematic, has been taken to its absolute absurd limit. So, like you rightly say, 130 square kilometers of forest are being diverted in the Nicobars, and a large part of it will be cut. The government says we will not cut the entire area, but even if you cut half of it, which they say they certainly will, it's a huge loss. Now, this is going to be compensated by, and they've already done it, by declaring twice the area, 260 square kilometers of land in Haryana as forest in the Aravalis, and they're going to declare some land in Haryana, in Madhya Pradesh as well as forest in compensation. Now, ecologically, economically, it is just completely irrational. It's illogical. But there is some kind of a mechanism that by which it is technically it can be done. But the very fact that it should be allowed is deeply, deeply problematic, because there is no way that you can replace. It is just not an equivalent. It is not even comparing apples and oranges. And there are a couple of other very important things to keep in mind is that 260 square kilometers of land in a state like Haryana is a huge amount of land. Now, we have no idea of what this land actually has been. Was it forest land? Did it belong to communities? Was it village commons? Was it private ownership? What was the land use? What was the economic activity? And these 260 square kilometers will now come under the control of the state. So there could be multiple implications in Haryana as well, besides of no consequence, of no value to what's happening in Nicobar. So this is completely bizarre what has happened, and it just shows how insensitive and thoughtless the whole process has been.
Right. Now, despite, I mean, you have laid out, in some amount of, close detail, the kind of processes that were followed or not followed. I mean, I have to say, at the very least, they are very, very interesting to, very entertaining to listen to. Now, after, these clearances were granted, I mean, many ecologists, they were not happy for obvious reasons. Not just ecologists. I think many sane people were not happy, and they approached the National Green Tribunal (NGT) to appeal against this. Now, a six-judge bench of the Kolkata bench of the NGT heard their petitions against this project being given a go-ahead, and then they disposed of it very quickly. And I think some of the appellants were not heard and I think there was some irregularity in the composition of the bench. Can you please talk about this whole NGT aspect of this? Like, what happened? How come it sort of got processed so fast?
So we don't. It'll be very difficult to speculate on how and what happened in the NGT, but in the process that we have, the NGT is the first port of call in environmental matters. So concerned citizens and NGOs have taken up the matter. They filed a couple of petitions before the NGT Kolkata bench. One was challenging the environmental clearance, and the other was challenging the forest clearance. Both of which we have discussed in some detail just a short while ago. Now, the NGT. So there were procedural issues in the way the NGT followed up on this. It was filed before the Calcutta bench, but it was kind of pulled to the central bench, and that's how it became a six-member bench. And I don't know the full details, but again, in the book that we spoke about, there's a very detailed and a very sharp article by well-known lawyer Norma Alvarez, who didn't argue the case but understands these matters very well. This was published in the leaflet, so it's also accessible online. And she's written in great detail about how the NGT completely failed the purpose of its creation where this project was concerned, in the sense of it was created as an expert body to look at environmental matters. But if you look at the decisions and the way the decisions were made in actually dismissing the petitions and the concerns of the petitioners, it ended up being completely on procedural matters. It basically said, oh, the concerned agencies of the government have said it is okay, and that's why it's okay. But that is precisely what the NGT should be looking at. And also they referred to some newspaper report about strategic concerns, and which is not really their mandate, and that would not be the way to look at it even if they did. So they, I think, failed to realize completely what the scale and the magnitude of this whole thing was. Now, how and why and what happened, one can only speculate, and that doesn't really help. But to cut a long story short, very, very unfortunate, very disappointing. But in spite of doing all that, the scale of this project and the problems are so large that even that bench had could not give a clean sheet. They laid out some concerns and they asked for a high part committee to be set up, which itself is a story of its own of what it did. But in spite of, like you say, very quickly ignoring and dismissing the concerns, they were not in a position to give it a complete clean sheet. So at least to make a, let's put it this way, to show that there was some concern, they highlighted some 3 or 4 points and asked that this needs to be looked into. So some of those matters are still going on because concerns were raised by the petitioners on the composition of the high part committee, because most of the members of the high part committee are representatives of the institutions that have granted permission. So there's a conflict of interest there. Also, the mandate that was given, we believe, was not fully fulfilled by the high part committee. They took very long. Their report is not in the public domain. They've gone ahead and changed the ground rules of how a CRZ category is notified on the ground. So there are serious concerns, and the matter is still, some parts of the matter is still being discussed before the NGT. And we are hopeful that the NGT will take cognizance of the fact that there are many, many problems with the way the clearance has been granted and very fact of the project is being proposed over here.
Right. I mean, you just mentioned that the NGT made a reference to the strategic concerns involved and so on. I mean, that is actually, I think, one of the main arguments being trotted out in favor of this project, which is China's so-called string of pearls approach to the Indian Ocean, encirclement and so on. And our military and commercial installations on Great Nicobar are expected to counter this whole string of pearls thing. So, what are your thoughts on this argument? And assuming that this strategic concern is, of course, a genuine and valid one, isn't there a sustainable or a less destructive way of going about protecting India's maritime security interests in this region? Other than this mega project that sort of involves flattening 130 square kilometers of tropical evergreen forest.
So, the first thing, Sampath, the question that has to be asked is, where is the defense component in this 72,000 crore project? So we've been talking about this defense component, but this is an out and out commercial project. We are talking of a 35,000 to 40,000 crore transshipment commercial port, right? This is a completely commercial activity. The 160 square kilometers of township that you spoke about is a commercial township. They're talking about tourism resort. They're talking about golf courses. So there's a power plant and there's an airport. Now, which of this is a defense project? It is not there anywhere in the document. As a matter of fact, a slightly later AECOM India report, and I'm reading from this was published, I think, in August of 2021. It says that Great Nicobar Island needs to trade on its remoteness and executive beauty, some exquisite beauty. Some high net worth individuals will appreciate the chance to have a luxury home on such an unspoilt island. Now, this is the framing of the whole thing. This is the fundamental premise of this project. It's a commercial project. So, where is the defense component coming in? That would be point number one. Point number two, so we have to bear in mind the tectonic vulnerability of this place. Now, you have, we discussed it briefly, but I would like to mention is that exactly 20 years ago, we are on the 20th anniversary of the tsunami of 2004. And I've just been reading just of yesterday, there is a paper in Nature that talks about the scale of the earthquakes and the damage that took place. And it is unbelievable the kind of things that have happened. What happened in Great Nicobar, and this is well known, it's been known for 20 years, is the coastline of Great Nicobar Island and where the project is coming up, the port is coming up, sank that morning of December 26 by 15 feet. There was 15 feet of permanent subsidence. And the evidence of that, if required, is where the lighthouse of Indira Point stands today. So, the very famous southernmost tip of India, the lighthouse. If you look for a picture of the lighthouse pre 2004, you can see it stands about 50 to 60 meters above the high tide line. Today, that lighthouse stands surrounded by waters of the Andaman Sea. Now, you are locating such a large project, you're making such a large investment, you're bringing in 350,000 people to this landscape that sees earthquakes once a week on an average. Now, even if you were to put a defense project, are you not creating vulnerability? And I'm just quoting here from this Nature paper that was published just 2 days ago, and it says 2004 earthquake triggered a series of aftershocks, including more than 6,000 earthquakes of 4.5 on the Richter scale in the first 10 years, two of which were 8.6 and 8.4 events. So, this is a case where earthquakes are going to happen and what are known as tsunami genic earthquakes are going to happen. So, even if you created an infrastructure, you're putting it in harm's way, right? That's point number two. Now, point number three, I think we have to look at what the defense experts are saying. And very recently, there's, I think, a very kind of, I think, game changing interview by former Chief of Naval Staff, Admiral Arun Prakash, in the Civil Society. He makes two or three very important points, including in some editorials in the Indian Express. Says we have to be extremely careful about the ecology and the indigenous people. This project is not cognizant of that reality. That's point number one. Point number two, and there's a very interesting question. I'm going to read it out from the interview. The question is, and this is to the former Chief of Navy. He's asked how imminent is the danger of China occupying these islands in military terms. And he says, while it might have been a possibility a few decades ago, it's a far-fetched idea today. So the idea that there might be security concerns, there's no doubt about that. The other thing he also says is that yes, there are security concerns, but it can be done much, much better and it can be done with a much lighter hand. So all this put together, I think we have to ask very critically, what is this concern of strategy that is being raised at multiple levels? First, this is not a strategic or defense project. It's a completely commercial project.
I think one of the arguments which of this whole strategic stream of thinking has to do with the economics. I think they want a competitive edge over Singapore, and in terms of the shipping traffic, attracting the shipping traffic, and India being able to oversee the shipping traffic more closely. Much of this traffic comes from China. That is the kind of arguments I've been hearing. Yeah.
Yeah. So see, that is so when we talk of strategic, there is the defense concern, which we've just been discussing, and then there is the argument that this will make economic sense. And that is something that we need to engage with more, because how is it going to make economic sense? Because this project is not going to be commissioned fully for 30 years. What will be the scale of investment, or what is the projections of traffic? What will be the revenue generated? If this is a transshipment port, where is the hinterland? Where will that cargo go? These are questions that people are asking, and actually Admiral Prakash also asks and mentions exactly these points in the same interview I'm talking about in response to a different question. The other issue, of course, is with the kind of ports that we are seeking to replace, Singapore, Hong Kong, which are masters in the game, which have been there for a very long time, whose I'm assuming their efficiency, their capacity, their experience is huge. Is it just so simply easily going to be possible to one day come and kind of just take away business? Is it going to be so attractive? Is it going to be so lucrative for traffic to come here? The answer may be yes, but somebody has to ask those questions. Somebody has to put those figures down. And will competing ports allow traffic to be taken away so easily? So these are all ideas that are completely, I would argue, not having enough basis. Very little documentation or very little data on what are the projections. There is something in the ecom report which says this will be the traffic and this will be how much cargo is expected, etc. But with sea level rises, with the changing dynamics, with we don't know what's going to happen. The kind of investment that's being made, what is the guarantee that all of this will pan out? And what if it does not? Who will take the risk? Who is going to make that investment? These are all very big questions. And the questions of economic viability are also very central. In an earthquake prone zone, where you have the largest earthquake in human history, the biggest tsunami was the tsunami of 20 years ago. Imagine you put 20,000 crores or 30,000 or 40,000 crores on that coastline. There's another earthquake, another land shifts, the entire port becomes inoperational. What happens to the lives of those people that are there? It's unimaginable the damage that happened 20 years ago, and how we are completely ignoring that damage. So even if there was a possibility of that economic activity, at what risk? I think is a question that have not been asked enough, and a lot of people are asking, and there are no answers for that question.
I mean, speaking of risk, Pankaj, I mean, but the two big things which stand out for me. One is, of course, this earthquake, because we have seen it happen. It was complete horror, the 2004 tsunami. The lighthouse, which was above the 50 feet above the tide line, is now underwater. So there is the subsidence you talked about. So there is, on the one hand, the earthquake seismic risk, and on the other hand, you have the rising sea level, which has been happening, and many of these island nations are really worried, they're troubled, disturbed, and so now in this scenario, we are thinking of settling 350,000 people from, I think, mostly from mainland India, to come and stay there. Do you think so many people, so many Indians would be willing to risk their lives, the lives of their children and their families, to come and live there and work there? Do you think it's going to happen? Are there so many desperate Indians who are going to willing to take such a risk?
I mean, that's a very good question, and I have no clue what the answer is. I don't know what the project proponents are thinking. Who are these people? Why will they come there? When will they come there? Because it's going to be extremely difficult to do this project even. And I might also just add over here, Sampath, the project proponent, and this is something that we did a detailed piece for the Hindu very recently. Is the project proponent is a quasi-government organization based in Port Blair, which is a company with an annual turnover of 350 crores. Their annual profit on an average is 50 crores a year. They basically have experience in selling liquor, petrol, milk, vegetables, and they do some tourism operations in these islands. This entity has been entrusted with the responsibility of investing and doing a project of 75,000 crores in the world's most seismically active and the most technically challenging project. Now, can we trust them to do justice and keep the people and the investment safe? What is the basis of giving them and making them the project proponents? How will they ensure the safety of these 350,000 people who come there, who are brought there? So I don't think that this has been really thought through. And that is really the problem with the whole thing. And uh, thought through even in the basic terms, leave alone the more sophisticated, the more nuanced, the more the more fundamental issues, like you spoke of the first principles, of the precautionary principle, of the value of the biodiversity, of the rights of the tribal people, of the tectonic activity and the vulnerability. None of this seems to be in the equation, and yet we are just going ahead as if nothing matters.
No, if this hasn't been thought through, I mean, let me just try and get you to do a little thought experiment for the benefit of all the people who haven't thought this through. I mean, let's assume that this 72,000 crore project actually takes off. I mean, can you, off the top of your head, give us some kind of a hypothetical picture or timeline of how you think it's going to go down, after 5 years, after 10 years, 15, 20, 30 years? I mean, how is it going to pan out for the next generation of Indians, our children, who are going to be living or working or going there to cut trees or whatever? The next 10, 15, 20 years, how do you think the project will pan out? Is it, when you have said it's not very easy it's not going to be very easy to implement it, but if it were to go ahead, how do you see it happening in this context of sea level rising and all those other aspects?
I really wouldn't speculate, some, but very difficult to say. But I know I'm not answering your question, but I just really hope that we don't get that far. I just hope that we see the value of this place, we see the rights of the people, we recognize the risks that are involved, and we don't put our money, our people, both the islanders and the settlers, are very precious biodiversity. And when I say our, I don't mean India, I mean this planet. The giant leatherback turtles that nest in these islands after nesting, they go 10,000 kilometers to Australia on the one hand, and they go 12,000 kilometers to the east to Madagascar and Africa, the African coast on the other hand. So these are deep connections that go far beyond the human species even came to be.
But they don't come to Delhi to talk to anyone,
I know.
unfortunately.
I mean, and in that sense, I'm glad we're having this conversation. And as a matter of fact, I must say that the Hindu group of publications, both the Hindu newspaper and the Frontline, have from the very beginning have been carrying stories and be talking about this project. As a matter of fact, among the first stories that were carried and which I did were for the Hindu in 2021. There was a series of stories. I did about 5 or 6 stories for the Hindu. Other journalists have done that. Now the media has picked it up. So I think there is, and the hope and the positive side is that we are getting to talk about it. That people are concerned. There's a lot of media. There are a lot of questions being asked, and I'm hopeful that we will see the futility of trying to do this project from all angles.
On that question of hope, is there anything more than hope here? Is there any legal option, say, such as going to the Supreme Court to sort of go further in appeal against all these whatever we have done with NGT and so on? Are there any other options legally available to sort of save this island from this kind of a project, so to speak?
So I'm not really a legal expert, but from my understanding, yes, I think the recourse is always there. We have our legal system, and like I mentioned earlier, the NGT is the first port of call. So there is also in the system the High Court, and then of course the Supreme Court, and we'll have to see if anybody is interested, and we have willing petitioners, and the matter can be taken forward. But so that certainly is one possibility of raising concerns. But I also feel that even within the system, even before we go there, with public mobilization, there have been some, like I said, a lot of media interest. Youth groups have raised concerns. Ecologists are beginning to speak about their concerns on this whole thing. So the general public will perhaps take notice. Our lawmakers, our bureaucrats will hopefully take notice. So I'm hoping that we will see the value of this place and what we seek to lose for gains that will hardly be there, if any at all. But yes, hope is there, and we have to keep trying, because this is a valuable place, and what is of value to us, and many of us, we are trying to see what we can do about it. So hopefully, we have to wait and watch. We've been trying constantly to uh, put out information, gather information, document, raise concerns, which is also why we're having this conversation today. The very fact that you noticed it and you want to talk about it. So there certainly is hope, and more.
Great. I mean, let's hope that there is more conversation around this topic. I think from every side, there might be many people who have strong views that this project should go ahead. I think even they should be part of this conversation, and hopefully, people will see the value of what is at stake here and achieve some kind of resolution that is in the benefit of the people and the species and the animals and the birds and the plants and the trees on that island first and foremost. Thank you so much, Pankaj, for joining us and for sharing your really academically rigorous knowledge and insights on this very important topic. It was an absolute pleasure chatting with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sampath.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.